The blood-soaked telegram trembled in Josephine Gibson's hand as the stagecoach rattled over the rutted trail toward Redemption Creek. Her father was dead, murdered by outlaws, and the ranch she'd never seen was now her only inheritance in a world that had already taken everything else from her. The year was 1875, and the frontier showed no mercy to a 20-year-old woman with nothing but a carpetbag and grief for company. "Last stop before nightfall," the driver called, his voice nearly lost in the thunder of hooves and creaking wood. "Redemption Creek, 10 minutes." Josephine tucked the telegram into her bodice and pressed her forehead against the dusty window. The setting sun painted the vast Wyoming landscape in hues of amber and gold, stretching endlessly before her, beautiful but terrifying in its vastness. She had left behind a comfortable life in Boston after her mother's death, hoping to find connection with the father she barely knew. Now there would be no reunion, only a grave and a dilapidated ranch if the banker's letter was to be believed. The stagecoach lurched to a stop, and Josephine gathered her meager belongings. Her cream-colored traveling dress, once fashionable in Boston parlors, was now creased and stained with the dust of 1,000 miles. She descended from the coach, her high button boots touching western soil for the first time. Redemption Creek was little more than a wide spot in the trail, a general store, saloon, small church, and a handful of weathered buildings that seemed to sag under the weight of the endless sky. Nothing like the bustling streets of Boston she had known all her life. "Miss Gibson?" A thin man in a bowler hat approached, clutching a ledger. "Harold Winters, from the Cattleman's Bank. I'm afraid I've been tasked with meeting you." "Yes, that's me." She offered her gloved hand, which he shook limply. "My condolences about your father." Winters cleared his throat, discomfort evident in his watery eyes. "Terrible business, just terrible. I should inform you straight away that the situation with your father's property is complicated." Josephine steeled herself. "I'm aware the ranch may be in poor condition, Mr. Winters." "Poor condition would be a generous assessment, Miss Gibson." He wiped his brow with a handkerchief despite the cooling evening air. "Your father's debts exceeded the property's value even before his passing. The mortgage is in default, and frankly, the bank is prepared to foreclose within the month." The news struck Josephine like a physical blow. "But the telegram said I inherited the ranch." "You inherited the property, yes, along with all its encumbrances." Winters looked almost apologetic. "The ranch hasn't turned a profit in 3 years. The cattle are scattered, fences broken, and the house itself is barely habitable. Your father's gambling didn't help matters." Josephine felt tears threatening, but refused to let them fall, not here, not in the street before curious onlookers. "I see. And how much is owed?" "Nearly $1,500. Winters flipped through his ledger. "The bank would be willing to buy the property outright for $300, which would at least allow you passage back east." $300 for 500 acres and a house? Josephine's voice rose slightly. "No one wants that land, Miss Gibson. Your father's reputation has soured any potential buyers, and a woman alone can't run a cattle operation." Winters closed his ledger with finality. "It's a burden you shouldn't bear. Take the money, go home." Before Josephine could reply, the saloon doors across the street burst open, and a tall man strode out. Even from a distance, she could see he was different from the banker's son, bronzed and solid, moving with the easy confidence of someone comfortable in his own skin. His dark hat shadowed his face, but she could feel his gaze land on their conversation. "I'll need time to consider your offer, Mr. Winters," she said, turning back to the banker. "Time is something in short supply, Miss Gibson." Winters gestured to a small building down the street. "I've arranged lodging for you at Mrs. Holloway's boarding house for tonight. We can conclude our business tomorrow." Josephine nodded, gathering her carpetbag. As Winters walked away, she felt suddenly, desperately alone in the gathering dusk of an unfamiliar town. The tears she had been holding at bay threatened again. "Excuse me, miss." The deep voice startled her. The man from the saloon stood a respectful distance away, hat now in hand. He was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 30, with keen blue eyes and a face weathered by sun and wind rather than age. "Forgive the intrusion, I'm Russell Fletcher." He gestured to Winter's retreating form. "I couldn't help overhearing. You're Thomas Gibson's daughter? I am. She straightened, wary but desperate for any friendly face. Josephine Gibson. Your father was a good man, Miss Gibson, despite what some in this town might say. His expression was solemn. I worked your father's cattle drives for 3 seasons before starting my own place. Tom saved my life once during a river crossing. The mention of her father brought a fresh wave of grief. Thank you, Mr. Fletcher. It seems you knew him better than I did. Russell's gaze softened with understanding. Tom spoke of you often, kept a photograph on the mantel. He hesitated before continuing. If you're planning to see the ranch, I'd be willing to take you out there tomorrow. It's a rough ride, not suitable for the stagecoach. Josephine studied him, trying to discern his motives. In Boston, a gentleman wouldn't speak to an unaccompanied lady without proper introduction. But this wasn't Boston. Why would you offer that, Mr. Fletcher? You owe me nothing. I owed your father my life, madam. That debt transfers to his kin in my reckoning. He settled his hat back on his head. Besides, you should see what you're selling before you let Winters take it for a fraction of its worth. The banker says it's worthless. Russell Fletcher's mouth curved in a knowing half-smile that transformed his weathered face. Bankers say a lot of things, Miss Gibson, especially when they stand to profit. Your land borders the railroad survey. That water rights alone are worth more than Winters offered. Hope flickered briefly in Josephine's chest, quickly extinguished by reality. Even if that's true, Mr. Fletcher, I know nothing about ranching. I can't even ride a horse. Everyone starts somewhere. He glanced toward the boarding house. Get some rest. If you'd like to see your father's place, I'll be outside at 8 tomorrow morning. No obligation beyond that. Josephine hesitated, torn between Boston propriety and frontier practicality. Finally, she nodded. 8 o'clock then. Thank you, Mr. Fletcher. As promised. Russell was waiting with 2 horses at 8 the following morning. Josephine had slept poorly, haunted by dreams of a father she barely remembered and a future she couldn't envision. She'd donned her simplest day dress, though it was still woefully impractical for riding. Morning, Miss Gibson. Russell tipped his hat, his expression revealing nothing about her obvious unsuitability for the journey ahead. This is Penny. He patted the neck of a gentle-looking chestnut mare. She's patient with newcomers. I've never been on a horse in my life, Mr. Fletcher, Josephine admitted, eyeing the animal with trepidation. Then today's a day for firsts. He offered his interlaced hands as a step. Put your foot here, grab the saddle horn, and I'll boost you up. After some awkward maneuvering and rearranging of skirts, Josephine found herself perched atop the mare, gripping the saddle horn with white knuckles. The ground seemed impossibly far away. Relax your shoulders and move with her, Russell advised, mounting his own horse with practiced ease. Penny knows the way. She'll follow Storm here without trouble. They set off at a gentle pace, and gradually Josephine's death grip on the saddle eased. The morning was crisp and clear, the vast Wyoming landscape opening before them as they left the small town behind. Russell rode slightly ahead, occasionally pointing out landmarks or naming distant mountains. He didn't press her with questions or unwanted conversation, seeming to understand her need for silence as she absorbed the unfamiliar world around her. After nearly 2 hours of riding, they crested a ridge and Russell reined his horse to a stop. There it is, Gibson Ranch. Below them stretched a valley bisected by a glittering creek. A small cabin with a sagging porch sat nestled against a stand of cottonwoods. Beyond it, Josephine could see a weathered barn, corrals, and the remnants of fences stretching toward distant pastures. Cattle fewer than she would have expected grazed in scattered groups across the landscape. Josephine struggled to find appropriate words. Seen better days, Russell finished for her. But the bones are good. Your father built that cabin himself, hauled timber from the mountains. The land's fertile, and that creek doesn't run dry even in August. They rode down into the valley, and as they approached the cabin, Josephine felt a strange mix of connection and alienation. This had been her father's home for 20 years, yet it was completely foreign to her. Russell helped her dismount, her legs wobbly after the long ride. Take your time, he said. I'll check the barn while you look around. Josephine approached the cabin with trepidation. The door creaked on rusty hinges as she pushed it open. Inside, dust motes danced in the beams of sunlight streaming through dirty windows. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a rough-hewn table with mismatched chairs, a bedstead with a straw mattress, shelves lined with books and tools, simple furnishings, but signs of a life lived. On the mantel, just as Russell had said, sat a small tarnished frame. Josephine picked it up, wiping away dust to reveal a faded photograph of herself at age 5, sitting on her mother's lap. Her throat tightened with emotion. "He kept it polished up nicer when he was alive." Russell's voice came from the doorway. "Would set it out for supper like you were there with him." "I never knew," she whispered, replacing the frame carefully. "Mother would read his letters to me when I was small, but they stopped coming after a while. She said he'd found a new life out west that didn't include us." Russell leaned against the doorframe, hat in hand. "That doesn't sound like the Tom Gibson I knew." "He showed me your letters, kept them in a tin box under his bed. Said they were his most valuable possession." Confusion creased Josephine's brow. "My letters? I never wrote to him." A shadow passed over Russell's face. "He had a stack of them. Said they came regular until about 3 years ago." "That's impossible. Josephine stopped, a terrible understanding dawning. "My mother died 3 years ago. She must have been writing them herself, pretending they were from me." The realization was a knife twist of guilt. Her mother had lied, kept father and daughter apart with fabricated correspondence. "I'm sorry, Miss Gibson." Russell's voice was gentle. "For what it's worth, he never stopped hoping you'd come west one day." Josephine turned away, blinking back tears. "And now, I've arrived too late." "You're here now," Russell said simply. "Question is, what do you aim to do about it?" She ran her fingers along the rough-hewn table, considering his question. "Mr. Winters says the ranch is in default, $1,500 in debt." Russell nodded, his expression grave. "Cattle prices have been low since '73. Your father had bad luck with 2 consecutive hard winters. Lost nearly half his herd. And there's no way to make that money back?" "Not without investment and hard work," Russell admitted. "The spring cattle drive could bring 500 if you gather the remaining herd, but you'd need hands to help, supplies, and time." Josephine turned to face him. "And even if I managed all that, a woman can't run a ranch alone." "No," Russell agreed, "not alone." Their eyes met, a moment of perfect understanding passing between them. Josephine wasn't sure if it was desperation or something deeper that made her next words tumble out. "Would you help me, Mr. Fletcher?" "I can pay you from whatever we make on the cattle drive." Russell studied her for a long moment. "Why would you want to try? You could take Winter's offer, go back to Boston, back to civilization." "Because this was his," she said softly, looking around the simple cabin. "Because he kept my picture on his mantel and my letters under his bed. Because I think someone made sure we stayed apart, and I won't let them win now that he's gone." A slow smile spread across Russell's face, genuine admiration in his eyes. "You've got more of Tom in you than you know, Miss Gibson." He extended his hand. "I'll help you, but not for pay. Partnership. We bring in the herd together, make the drive together, split the profits. If we succeed, we talk about next steps. If we fail, at least you'll know you tried." Josephine hesitated only briefly before taking his calloused hand in her gloved one. "Partnership, then. Though I must warn you, Mr. Fletcher, I don't know the first thing about cattle." "You can learn," he said, his grip firm and reassuring. "And you might start by calling me Russ. Partners shouldn't stand on formality." "Josie," she offered in return. "No one's called me that since I was a girl, but I think I'd like to hear it again." They released hands, and Russ nodded toward the door. "Well then, Josie, let's see what we're working with. Daylight's burning, and we've got a ranch to save." The next morning, Josephine awoke before dawn in her small room at Mrs. Holloway's boarding house, muscles aching from the previous day's ride. She had barely slept, her mind racing with all she had learned and the monumental task ahead. The banker, Mr. Winters, had been apoplectic when she'd informed him she wouldn't be selling. "You're making a grave mistake, Miss Gibson," he had warned, his face flushing. "That land will swallow every penny and ounce of strength you possess, then leave you destitute." "Perhaps," she had replied with more confidence than she felt, "but it's my mistake to make." Now, as she dressed in the borrowed clothes, Mrs. Holloway had provided a simple cotton shirt, sturdy canvas trousers, and a worn leather belt, Josephine questioned her own sanity. What did she know of ranching? Of cattle drives? Of this harsh country where water was precious and danger lurked in every shadow? A knock at the boarding house door downstairs startled her from her thoughts. Moments later, Mrs. Holloway's voice called up, "Miss Gibson, Mr. Fletcher is here for you." Josephine hurried down, self-consciously tugging at the men's clothing that hung loosely on her frame. Mrs. Holloway, a plump, practical woman in her 50s, gave her an approving nod. "Much more sensible than those Eastern fripperies," she said, "though we'll need to take in those trousers before you trip and break your neck." Russ waited by the door, hat in hand. If he was surprised by her attire, he hid it well. "Morning, Josie. Ready to get started?" "As I'll ever be," she replied, accepting the battered hat he offered. Outside, Penny waited patiently beside Russ's larger gelding. A wagon loaded with supplies was hitched to a pair of draft horses. "We'll need supplies out at the ranch," Russ explained, helping her mount. "Food, seed, tools. Mrs. Holloway put together enough to get us through a few weeks." "Mr. Fletcher," Josephine began hesitantly, "I have very little money, just what was left from my mother's estate. This is part of my investment in our partnership," he said, swinging up into his saddle. "We'll settle accounts after the drive." As they rode through town, Josephine felt the weight of curious stares. Word had clearly spread about Thomas Gibson's Eastern daughter and her foolhardy attempt to save the failing ranch. Some looks were merely curious, others openly scornful. Outside the saloon, 3 men watched their passage with undisguised hostility. "Friends of yours?" Josephine asked quietly. "Hardly," Russ replied, his expression hardening. "That's Eli Thorne and his brothers. They've had their eye on your father's water rights for years. Thorne runs the largest spread in the county, and he doesn't take kindly to competition." "Were they responsible for my father's death?" Josephine asked bluntly. Russ's hesitation told her everything. "The sheriff couldn't prove anything. Officially, your father was killed by unknown outlaws." "But you don't believe that?" "I believe Thorne is dangerous," Russ said carefully, "and he won't be happy about our arrangement." They rode in silence after that, Josephine absorbing this new information. When they finally reached the ranch, Russ immediately set her to work, not the delicate ornamental tasks she was accustomed to, but hard physical labor that left her hands blistered and her back aching. "First thing we need is a functioning corral to hold the cattle we round up," he explained, showing her how to replace broken fence rails. "Then we fix the roof on the barn before the spring rains." Days blurred into a grueling routine of hard work from dawn until dusk. Josephine learned to hammer nails, mend fences, curry horses, and cook over an open fire. Each night she collapsed onto her father's bed in the cabin, while Russ slept in the barn to maintain propriety, despite the practical inconvenience. A week after they began, 2 men rode into the yard, one young and wiry, the other older, with a silver-streaked beard. Both regarded Josephine with undisguised curiosity. "Josie, meet Charlie Wilkins and his son Jeremiah," Russ introduced them. "Best cowhands in the territory, if you can overlook their ugly mugs. Miss Gibson." The older man touched his hat respectfully. "Your pa was a good boss. We came to offer our services for the roundup and drive." "I wish I could pay you properly," Josephine admitted. Charlie exchanged glances with his son. "We'll take our usual share from the drive profits. Your pa would have done the same for us." Over the next days, more help arrived, weathered men who had ridden with her father and held his memory in high regard. By the end of the second week, they had a crew of 7 experienced cowhands ready to begin the spring roundup. The actual work of gathering cattle scattered across miles of rangeland was beyond anything Josephine had imagined. She rode from sunup to sundown, learning to guide cattle with voice and presence, to read weather and terrain, to spot strays hidden in ravines or thickets. Her soft hands grew calloused, her fair skin tanned and weathered. Russ was a patient but demanding teacher. "Lower your center," he would call, as she struggled to stay mounted during a particularly vigorous cattle chase. "Feel the horse's rhythm, don't fight it." At night, around the campfire, the men shared stories of her father, tales of his generosity, his stubbornness, his famous temper when riled. Through their words, Thomas Gibson became real to her in a way he had never been before. "Your pa once rode 40 miles in a blizzard to bring medicine to my wife," Charlie told her one evening, his weathered face softened by firelight. "Probably saved her life. Wouldn't take a penny for it either." "He taught me to read," young Jeremiah admitted shyly. "Said a man should know his letters, even if he rides for a living." Each story was a gift, filling in the blank spaces of a father Josephine had never truly known. And each day, she caught Russ watching her with increasing respect as she tackled tasks that would have been unthinkable in her Boston life. By the end of April, they had gathered nearly 200 head of cattle bearing the Gibson brand, fewer than they had hoped, but enough for a modest drive. The real test would come in getting them to the railhead at Cheyenne, a journey of over 100 miles through difficult terrain. The night before they were to begin the drive, Josephine sat on the cabin porch, mending a torn shirt by lantern light. Russ joined her, offering a cup of coffee. "Charlie thinks we can make Cheyenne in 2 weeks if the weather holds," he said, settling beside her on the step. "The herd looks good, better than I expected." "Will it be enough?" she asked, setting aside her sewing. "To pay the bank, I mean." "It'll be close," Russ admitted. "Cattle prices are up slightly. If we get a fair deal, we should clear enough to satisfy Winters for now." Josephine studied his profile in the golden lantern light. Over the past weeks, she had come to rely on his quiet strength, his unfailing patience, his dry humor when things went wrong. There was a steadiness to Russell Fletcher that anchored her in this unfamiliar world. "I've never thanked you properly," she said softly, "for believing this was possible when everyone else said it wasn't." Russ kept his eyes on the distant hills, though something in his posture shifted, grew more alert. "You've done the work, Josie. I just showed you how. We both know that's not true. You've invested your time, your money, your reputation. Why?" He was quiet so long she thought he might not answer. Finally, he turned to face her, his expression serious in the wavering light. "Your father saved my life once. But that's not why I'm here." He set his coffee cup down carefully. "I believe in this land. I believe in what can be built here with hard work and determination. And I believe in you, Josephine Gibson. You could have taken Winter's money and gone back east to comfort and ease. Instead, you stayed and fought." Their eyes met, and something electric passed between them, a recognition, an understanding that transcended words. For a breathless moment, Josephine thought he might move closer, might take her hand, or even dare to kiss her. Instead, he stood abruptly. "Dawn comes early," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "Best get some rest before the drive." As he walked toward the barn, Josephine remained on the porch, her heart racing with emotions she wasn't ready to name. The cattle drive began at first light, the herd strung out across the valley floor like a living river. Josephine rode swing position, helping keep the cattle bunched and moving in the right direction. The work was exhausting, but exhilarating, every sense alert to the sounds and movements of hundreds of animals, the changing terrain, the shifting weather. On the third day, disaster struck. A sudden thunderstorm rolled in from the mountains, lightning cracking across the darkened sky. The cattle, already nervous from crossing unfamiliar territory, spooked at a particularly loud thunderclap. Within moments, the orderly drive dissolved into chaos as panicked animals scattered in all directions. "Stampede!" Charlie's voice carried over the thunder and the drumming of hooves. "Head 'em off!" Josephine found herself riding harder than she ever had, rain pelting her face as she urged Penny toward the front of the fleeing cattle. Russ appeared beside her, his face grim with concentration, as they worked to turn the leaders, to bend the stampede into a circle that would eventually slow and stop the frenzied animals. Lightning struck a nearby tree, sending splinters flying. Penny reared in terror, and Josephine, caught unprepared, tumbled from the saddle. She hit the ground hard, rolling to avoid the pounding hooves that threatened to trample her. Pain lanced through her ankle as she scrambled toward the dubious shelter of a rock outcropping. Through the curtain of rain, she saw Russ dismount and run toward her, heedless of the danger. He reached her just as a group of cattle thundered past, shielding her body with his own as dirt and debris rained down around them. "Are you hurt?" he shouted over the storm's fury. "My ankle," she gasped, clutching his rain-soaked shirt. "I think it's sprained." Somehow, he got her onto his horse and to safety as the other cowboys continued working to contain the stampede. By nightfall, they had recovered most of the scattered herd, though nearly 20 head were lost, a significant blow to their already tight margins. In the hastily established camp, Russ examined Josephine's ankle by firelight, his touch gentle as he wrapped it with strips torn from a spare shirt. "You should be off it for a few days," he said, his brow furrowed with concern. "We don't have a few days," Josephine protested. "The bank's deadline." "Won't matter if you cripple yourself," Russ cut her off firmly. "You'll ride in the chuck wagon tomorrow. Charlie's boy can take your position." That night, despite her protests, Russ slept beside the wagon, close enough to hear if she needed anything. Josephine lay awake, listening to the gentle patter of rain on the canvas cover and the occasional lowing of cattle. She thought of how Russ had risked himself to reach her during the stampede, how naturally he had placed himself between her and danger. The realization that had been building for weeks crystallized in that moment. She was falling in love with Russell Fletcher. The knowledge was both terrifying and exhilarating. What future could there possibly be for a Boston-bred lady and a Wyoming cowboy? Yet she couldn't imagine returning to her old life now, couldn't imagine a world without his steady presence beside her. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind mud and damp, but also clearer skies. The drive continued, with Josephine relegated to the wagon until her ankle healed enough for riding. She chafed at the inactivity but used the time to observe the landscape with new eyes, noting water sources, good grazing land, sheltered valleys that might serve the ranch well in future seasons. On the 10th day, they encountered another obstacle. This one human. Eli Thorne and half a dozen armed men blocked a narrow pass the drive needed to traverse. "That's Gibson Range you're crossing," Thorne called as Russ rode forward to meet him. "And Gibson cattle you're driving." "That's right," Russ agreed evenly, though Josephine could see tension in his posture, even from her position in the wagon. "Gibson Ranch is under new management." "So I've heard." Thorne's gaze shifted to the wagon where Josephine sat. "Tom's eastern daughter playing at rancher. Word is, she can't tell a steer from a milk cow." Josephine's face burned, but she held her ground when Thorne rode closer to inspect her. "This isn't Boston, Miss Gibson," he said, contempt evident in his tone. "The West isn't kind to women alone. Tom found that out the hard way." "Are you threatening me, Mr. Thorne?" Josephine asked coolly, refusing to be intimidated despite the fear churning in her stomach. "Just stating facts. Ranching's hard enough for men born to it." "For a city girl?" He shook his head. "My offer stands. $500 for the whole spread. More than fair considering the state of things." "The ranch isn't for sale," Josephine replied firmly. "Not to you, not to anyone." Thorne's face darkened. "You're making a mistake, girl. Same one your stubborn fool of a father made." Russ moved his horse between them, his hand resting casually near his holstered revolver. "We need to get these cattle through, Thorne. You're blocking a public trail." For a tense moment, Josephine thought violence would erupt. Then Thorne smiled coldly and signaled his men to move aside. "Get your beeves to market, Fletcher. Won't change anything. Bank'll foreclose on Gibson land within the month, and then we'll see who's the better businessman." As they passed, Thorne called after them, "She's nothing but a burden, Fletcher, a burden that'll drag you down with her." Russ's shoulders stiffened, but he didn't turn around. Once they were safely past, Josephine maneuvered herself to the wagon's front seat beside the driver. "What did he mean about my father?" she asked quietly. The older man driving the wagon glanced at her uneasily. "Don't pay Thorne no mind, Miss Gibson. He's full of hot air." "Please," Josephine insisted. "I need to know." The driver sighed, checking that none of the other hands were close enough to hear. "Your pa refused to sell to Thorne, same as you." Week later, Thorne spread word around town that Tom Gibson had cheated at cards, stolen cattle, all manner of falsehoods. Blackened your pa's name so no one would extend him credit. When that didn't drive him off, well, he trailed off uncomfortably. "The unknown outlaws who killed him," Josephine finished, cold certainty settling in her chest. The driver nodded grimly. "Can't prove nothing, but timing's mighty suspicious." That night, Josephine sought out Russ as he checked the herd. Her ankle was healing, allowing her to walk with only a slight limp. "Thorne killed my father, didn't he?" she asked without preamble. Russ didn't insult her intelligence by denying it. I believe so. Sheriff thinks the same, but Thorne's got too many friends in high places. Why does he want our land so badly? Water and location, Russ explained, leading her away from camp where they could speak privately. Your creek is one of the few that doesn't run dry in summer, and with the railroad coming through next year, any connecting property will triple in value. So it's not just about survival, Josephine realized. It's about the future. Your father knew that. It's why he held on despite everything Thorne threw at him. Russ's expression softened in the moonlight. Tom Gibson was looking to your future, Josie, even if he never got to see you again. He wanted to leave you something of value. Tears pricked Josephine's eyes, and I almost threw it away. But you didn't. Russ's hand found hers in the darkness. You stayed and fought, just like he would have. His touch sent warmth spiraling through her, despite the cool night air. They stood like that for a long moment, connected by more than just their joined hands. Thorne was wrong, you know, Russ said softly, about you being a burden. Was he? Josephine's voice wavered. I've needed so much help, so much teaching. We all need help sometimes. His thumb traced gentle circles on her palm. The truth is, Josie Gibson, you're not a burden. You're a blessing. The words hung between them, weighted with meaning that transcended their simple partnership. Josephine's heart hammered against her ribs as Russ leaned closer, his free hand coming up to brush a strand of hair from her face. His touch lingered on her cheek, warm and calloused. Russ, she whispered, unsure if it was a question or a plea. His response was to close the remaining distance between them, pressing his lips to hers in a kiss that started gentle but quickly deepened with weeks of unspoken longing. Josephine's arms wound around his neck, drawing him closer as she returned the kiss with equal fervor. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Russ rested his forehead against hers. I've been wanting to do that since you walked into that cabin wearing men's clothes and looking at everything like you could conquer it by sheer will. Josephine laughed softly. I've been wanting you to do that since you showed me how to fix a fence post and didn't laugh when I hit my thumb with the hammer. His arms tightened around her waist. This changes things, Josie. Good, she replied firmly. Some things need changing. They returned to camp separately, mindful of appearances, but something fundamental had shifted between them. The next morning, as they prepared to continue the drive, Josephine caught Russ watching her with naked affection that warmed her more than the rising sun. The remainder of the journey passed without major incident. Josephine's ankle healed enough for her to return to horseback, though Russ insisted she take easier duties. By the time they sighted Cheyenne's sprawling stockyards, the entire crew was exhausted but triumphant. The cattle brought better prices than they had dared hope, nearly $7 a head, enough to pay the bank and have a modest sum remaining for ranch improvements. As the last steer was sold and the final tally counted, the cowhands celebrated their success with whoops and backslaps. Couldn't have done better myself, Charlie told Josephine, genuine respect in his weathered face. Couldn't have done it at all without all of you, she replied honestly. That evening, after settling accounts with the crew, Josephine and Russ sat alone in a quiet corner of the hotel restaurant, savoring real coffee and hot food they hadn't cooked themselves over a campfire. What happens now? Josephine asked, the question encompassing far more than just the ranch's future. We go back, Russ said simply. Start rebuilding properly. With the bank satisfied for now, we can focus on increasing the herd, improving the buildings. He paused, studying her face. If that's what you want, is that what you want, Russ? She countered softly. To tie yourself to a struggling ranch and an Eastern woman who still can't properly rope a calf. His hand found hers across the table, fingers intertwining naturally. What I want is you, Josie. The ranch, the cattle, the hard work, those are just details. I want to build something with you, something that will last. Her heart swelled at his words, at the earnest affection in his blue eyes. Even if it means dealing with Thorne, he won't give up easily. Especially if it means dealing with Thorne, Russ replied grimly. What he did to your father can't go unanswered, but we'll face him together, on our terms. Together, Josephine repeated, liking the sound of it. As partners. As more than partners, I hope. Russ's expression grew serious. I know it's fast, Josie. I know we've only known each other a short time. But out here, life doesn't always give you the luxury of waiting. I love you. I think I started falling the moment you refused to sell to Winters. The simple declaration stole Josephine's breath. In Boston, courtships lasted months or years, proceeding through carefully choreographed stages of increasing intimacy. But, as Russ had said, the West operated by different rules, and her heart recognized the truth of his feelings because they mirrored her own. I love you too, she said, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. It terrifies me how much, how quickly, but it's true all the same. Russ's smile was like sunrise breaking across the plains. Marry me then, not just for the ranch or for propriety's sake, but because we belong together. I knew at the moment I saw you standing in the street, looking lost and determined all at once. Yes, Josephine answered without hesitation. Yes, I'll marry you, Russell Fletcher. They returned to Gibson Ranch 3 days later. As engaged, though not yet married, Josephine had insisted on at least that much adherence to convention. The ceremony would take place once the ranch was secure and the threat from Thorne neutralized. The weeks that followed were filled with backbreaking labor from dawn until dusk. They repaired the cabin roof, rebuilt corrals, mended miles of fence, and planted a garden that would supplement their diet through the coming winter. Charlie and Jeremiah Wilkins stayed on as permanent hands, along with 2 others who had ridden the drive with them. Thorne wasn't idle during this time. Twice they found fence lines cut and cattle scattered. Once, someone took shots at Russ and Charlie as they worked a distant section of the property. Each incident was reported to the sheriff, who investigated perfunctorily, but found no evidence linking Thorne directly to the sabotage. The tension came to a head in late July, when Josephine rode out alone to check on a pregnant heifer. She found the animal safely delivered of a healthy calf, but as she turned Penny toward home, 3 riders appeared on the ridge above her. Even at a distance, she recognized Eli Thorne's distinctive hat and broad shoulders. Heart pounding, Josephine urged Penny into a gallop, hoping to reach the ranch buildings before they intercepted her. She had nearly made it when a rifle shot cracked across the valley, spooking her mare. Penny stumbled, regained her footing, but the brief hesitation was enough for Thorne and his men to cut her off. "Afternoon, Miss Gibson," Thorne greeted her with mock courtesy, his horse dancing nervously beneath him. "Out for a pleasant ride?" "On my own property," Josephine replied evenly, fighting to keep fear from her voice. "What do you want, Mr. Thorne?" "Same thing I've always wanted. This land. I've been patient, but my patience is running thin." His false civility vanished, replaced by naked menace. "Fletcher's made you think you can win this fight. You can't." "The bank's been paid," Josephine countered. "We're turning a profit now. There's nothing you can do to change that." Thorne's smile was cold. "Accidents happen out here all the time, Miss Gibson." "Your father had an accident. Fletcher could have one too." The threat froze Josephine's blood, but she kept her expression neutral. "Is that a confession, Mr. Thorne, to my father's murder?" He laughed, genuinely amused. "You've got spirit, girl, I'll give you that. But spirit won't save you when winter comes, and you're alone with no one to help you." "She's not alone," a familiar voice called from behind Josephine. She turned to see Russ riding toward them, rifle resting casually across his saddle. Behind him came Charlie and the other hands, similarly armed. Relief flooded through her, though she was careful not to show it. "This doesn't concern you, Fletcher," Thorne growled. "Anything that concerns my fiancé concerns me," Russ replied mildly, though his eyes were hard as flint. "You're trespassing on Gibson land. I suggest you leave." For a tense moment, Josephine thought Thorne might order his men to open fire. The odds were in their favor with 6 hands against Thorne's 3. Instead, the rancher spat on the ground between them. "This isn't over," he warned, wheeling his horse around. "Not by a long shot." As they rode away, Josephine's composure finally broke, her hands trembling on the reins. Russ was at her side instantly, reaching across to steady her. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, eyes scanning for injuries. "No, just shaken," she assured him. "How did you know I needed help?" "Jeremiah spotted Thorne and his men heading this way," Russ explained, his jaw tight with anger. "We came as fast as we could." "He threatened you," Josephine said quietly. "The same way he must have threatened my father." Russ's expression softened as he looked at her. I'm not your father, Josie. I'm not alone, and neither are you. We've got good men with us, loyal men. Thorne can threaten all he wants, but we're stronger together. Back at the ranch, a council of war formed around the kitchen table. Charlie, grizzled and practical, laid out their options with brutal honesty. We can keep fighting him piece by piece, but that's playing his game, the old cowhand said. Sooner or later, he'll catch one of us alone, and there'll be another accident. We could sell, Jeremiah suggested hesitantly, then rushed to continue when he saw the other's expressions. Not to Thorne, to the railroad directly. They'd pay triple what the land is worth now. Josephine shook her head firmly. This was my father's home. It's going to be our home. She reached for Russ's hand. I won't be driven off by threats. Then we need to change tactics, Russ said thoughtfully. Thorne's power comes from fear and isolation. He's convinced everyone that opposing him is suicide. So we prove him wrong, Josephine finished, understanding dawning. We show people he can be stood up to, that we're not alone. The plan they formed was audacious and not without risk. The following day, Russ rode into town and spoke with the editor of the small local newspaper, sharing their suspicions about Thomas Gibson's murder and the ongoing harassment. The editor, a principled man who had long resented Thorne's influence but feared his reprisals, agreed to publish the story. Next, they contacted neighboring small ranchers who had also suffered under Thorne's tactics, families who had lost land, water rights, or livelihoods to the powerful cattlemen's machinations. Many were initially reluctant to join forces, but the promise of strength in numbers eventually won them over. By the end of August, a coalition had formed the Gibson-Fletcher Ranch at its center, surrounded by a network of allies committed to mutual defense and support. When Thorne's men cut fences now, 20 riders appeared to repair them. When cattle were scattered, twice that number helped round them up. The newspaper article detailing the evidence linking Thorne to Thomas Gibson's murder circulated throughout the territory, reaching as far as Cheyenne. The territorial governor, already concerned about vigilante justice in the region, dispatched a special investigator to look into the allegations. Thorne's retribution was swift and brutal. One night in early September, Josephine awoke to the smell of smoke and Russ's urgent voice. "Fire at the north barn!" he shouted, already pulling on his boots. "Wake the men!" She scrambled into clothes and ran outside to find the night sky painted orange with flames. The barn where they stored winter hay was ablaze, fire leaping from the dry timber to nearby fence posts. For hours they fought the fire, a chain of men and women passing buckets from the creek, others beating at flames with wet blankets, struggling to contain the destruction before it could spread to the main house or other buildings. By dawn, the barn was nothing but smoking ruins, but they had managed to save the rest of the ranch. Exhausted, soot-covered, and heartsick, Josephine surveyed the damage. The loss of the hay meant potential starvation for their cattle during the coming winter, unless they could purchase or grow replacement feed quickly. "He's getting desperate," Russ said, coming to stand beside her, his face grim beneath a layer of ash. "The investigator's been asking uncomfortable questions. Thorne knows he's running out of time." "What if he burns everything?" Josephine asked, voicing her deepest fear. "What if someone gets hurt next time?" Russ pulled her into his arms, heedless of the dirt and soot covering them both. "We'll rebuild, again and again if we have to. That's what ranchers do." Despite his confident words, Josephine could see the strain in his eyes. They had been fighting for months, and the toll was beginning to show not just on Russ, but on all of them. The constant vigilance, the repairs, the setbacks, it was exhausting their resources and their spirits. That night, alone in her room, Josephine made a decision. The next morning, she rode into town alone, heading not for the general store or the newspaper office, but for the sheriff's department. Sheriff Miller was a cautious man, neither corrupt nor particularly courageous. He listened to her carefully, occasionally making notes as she laid out everything they knew or suspected about Thorne's activities, not just the harassment of her ranch, but similar tactics used against others over the years. "This is all very troubling, Miss Gibson," he said when she had finished. "But without direct evidence linking Thorne to these acts, my hands are tied." "What would you consider direct evidence?" Josephine pressed. The sheriff rubbed his mustache thoughtfully. A witness, someone from Thorne's inner circle willing to testify against him, or catching him in the act. Josephine left the sheriff's office with a plan forming dangerous, perhaps foolhardy, but potentially decisive. She didn't share it with Russ or the others, knowing they would try to stop her. The opportunity came sooner than she expected. 2 days later, a message arrived at the ranch from one of Thorne's men, a young cowhand named Leland who had seemingly had a change of heart. "Mr. Thorne's planning something big," the note read. "Tomorrow night at the Hollow Creek crossing. Come alone or not at all." Russ was away, riding the boundary with Charlie, when the message arrived. Without allowing herself to reconsider, Josephine saddled Penny and rode toward the meeting place, a small creek crossing 5 miles from the ranch. She had left a note for Russ explaining her plan and her destination in case things went wrong. The sun was setting as she approached Hollow Creek, painting the landscape in shades of amber and gold. The meeting place was a small clearing surrounded by cottonwoods and willows, offering plenty of concealment for anyone wishing to remain hidden. Leland was waiting, his nervous posture visible even from a distance. He was young, barely 20, with a gaunt face and restless hands that couldn't seem to stay still. "You shouldn't have come alone," he said as she dismounted. "It's not safe." "I'm not afraid," Josephine replied, though her racing heart belied the claim. "You said Thorne is planning something?" Leland nodded, glancing anxiously over his shoulder. "He's desperate since that investigator came. Plans to burn you out completely tomorrow night, house, barns, everything. Wants to make it look like an accident." "And you're telling me this why?" Josephine asked cautiously. "Because my pa was friends with yours," the young man said, his voice dropping. "Because what happened to him wasn't right, and what's happening to you isn't right either. Thorne's gone too far." Before Josephine could respond, hoofbeats sounded nearby, multiple riders approaching fast. Leland's face drained of color. "It's a trap," he whispered, genuine fear in his eyes. "I'm sorry, Miss Gibson. He made me do it. Said he'd kill my sister if I didn't." Josephine's blood ran cold as Thorne and 4 armed men emerged from the trees, effectively cutting off any escape route. "Well done, Leland," Thorne said approvingly. "You can go now. Tell no one about this if you want your sister to remain healthy." The young man threw Josephine one last agonized look before mounting his horse and riding away at a gallop. "Miss Gibson," Thorne greeted her with exaggerated courtesy. "How convenient of you to visit such a remote location. Accidents happen in places like this all the time. Falls, drownings, all manner of tragedies." "People know where I am," Josephine bluffed, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I left word at the ranch." "With who?" "Fletcher's out riding the boundary. The hands are scattered." Thorne dismounted, approaching her with deliberate slowness. "By the time anyone misses you, you'll be long gone, and we'll be nowhere near here." Josephine stood her ground, though fear threatened to paralyze her. "What exactly do you plan to do, Mr. Thorne? Murder me like you murdered my father? Your father was stubborn, just like you. He could have taken my money, moved on, lived a long life elsewhere." Thorne shook his head in mock regret. "Such a waste." "And me?" Josephine asked, stalling for time, praying that Russ had returned to the ranch and found her note. "Another wasteful death?" "Oh, I think we can avoid that unpleasantness," Thorne said smoothly. "Sign over the ranch to me now, and you can ride away. Go back east where you belong, forget you ever saw Wyoming. And if I refuse?" His smile vanished. "Then your body washes up downstream in a day or 2. Tragic accident. The hazards of frontier life for an inexperienced Eastern woman." Josephine's mind raced, calculating distances and possibilities. She was outnumbered and outgunned. Even if she managed to reach Penny, they would easily run her down. Her only hope was to keep Thorne talking until help arrived, if it arrived at all. "Why not just buy another ranch?" she asked. "There must be dozens for sale across the territory." "None with your water rights and location." Thorne gestured impatiently. "Enough talking. Make your choice, Miss Gibson." "I choose my father's legacy," Josephine said firmly, lifting her chin. "I choose the home Russ and I are building together. I choose to fight you, Mr. Thorne, with every means at my disposal." Thorne's expression hardened. "Then you choose the same fate as Thomas Gibson." He nodded to his men. "Take her to the creek. Make it look like she fell from her horse and drowned." Two men dismounted and moved toward her. Josephine backed away, desperately looking for some means of escape, some weapon, anything that might save her. Her back hit the rough bark of a cottonwood, and she knew she had nowhere left to retreat. The crack of a rifle shot shattered the tense tableau. One of Thorne's men cried out, clutching his arm as blood seeped between his fingers. More shots followed, and suddenly the clearing was filled with mounted riders emerging from the surrounding trees. Russ at their head, face set in grim determination, rifle still smoking. "Step away from her, Thorne," he commanded, his voice carrying across the clearing. Thorne's men scrambled for cover, returning fire sporadically. Josephine took advantage of the confusion to run toward the creek bank, seeking shelter behind a fallen log. From her position, she could see Russ and at least a dozen others, not just their ranch hands, but neighboring ranchers who had joined their coalition. The gunfight was brief but intense. Outnumbered and outpositioned, Thorne's men quickly surrendered or fled. Thorne himself tried to reach his horse, but was cut off by Charlie and two other riders. When the shooting stopped, Russ dismounted and ran to Josephine, gathering her into his arms with desperate strength. "I thought I'd lost you," he murmured into her hair, his voice raw with emotion. "When I found your note—" "I'm sorry," she interrupted, clinging to him. "I thought I could get proof, something the sheriff couldn't ignore." "You did better than that," another voice interjected. They turned to see Sheriff Miller emerging from the trees, followed by the territorial investigator and two deputies. The lawmen had clearly witnessed the entire confrontation. "Threatening murder in front of witnesses, including law enforcement," the sheriff said, approaching the now restrained Thorne. "Not to mention attempted kidnapping and conspiracy. That's more than enough to see you hang, Thorne." As the deputies led Thorne away, the investigator approached Josephine and Russ. "Miss Gibson, your father would be proud. It took courage to stand up to a man like that." "Not just courage," Josephine corrected, looking at the assembled ranchers who had come to her aid. "It took community, something Thorne never understood." In the days that followed, evidence mounted against Eli Thorne. Freed from fear of reprisal, several of his former employees came forward with testimony about his illegal activities, including direct involvement in Thomas Gibson's murder. The territorial court wasted little time in reaching a guilty verdict, sentencing Thorne to hang for his crimes. With their most pressing threat removed, Josephine and Russ turned their attention back to the ranch and to each other. The wedding they had postponed was finally scheduled for the first week of October, a perfect time between the autumn harvest and winter's onset. The ceremony took place in the newly rebuilt barn, decorated with wild flowers and lanterns for the occasion. Half the county attended, ranchers, townsfolk, and cowboys alike, all bearing witness to the union of the Eastern lady and the Wyoming cowboy who had defied expectations and conventions to forge something enduring together. Josephine wore a simple white dress ordered from Cheyenne, her hair adorned with a crown of late-blooming asters and sage. Russ, uncomfortable but handsome in a new suit, waited for her at the front of the barn, his expression transforming to one of wonder as she walked toward him on Charlie's arm. "You are the most beautiful thing I've ever seen," he whispered as she reached him. The local minister kept the ceremony brief but meaningful, speaking of partnership, resilience, and love that flourishes even in harsh landscapes. When Josephine and Russ exchanged vows, their words were both traditional and uniquely their own promises to build together, to face whatever came side by side, to see blessings where others saw burdens. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister concluded with a broad smile. "Russell, you may kiss your bride." The kiss they shared was a promise and a celebration, witnessed by the community that had become their extended family. Cheers erupted around them, along with a few good-natured whistles from the cowhands. The celebration lasted well into the night, with dancing, feasting, and storytelling under stars that seemed to shine especially bright. As midnight approached, Josephine and Russ slipped away from the festivities, riding together toward the cabin that was now their home, not just a structure of logs and timber, but the heart of everything they had built and would continue to build together. On the porch, before crossing the threshold, Russ paused to look out over the ranch, their ranch silvered by moonlight. "Your father once told me something I've never forgotten," he said softly, his arm around Josephine's waist. "He said the measure of a life well lived isn't what you take from the land, but what you give back to it. I think he'd be mighty pleased to see what we're giving back now." "I wish I could have known him," Josephine said, leaning into her husband's embrace. "Known him as you did." "You would have loved each other," Russ assured her. "You're more like him than you know, stubborn, principled, unwilling to back down from what's right." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "And he would have been so proud of the woman you've become." As they stepped into their home together, Josephine felt a sense of completion, of rightness that transcended the hardships they had endured, and those that undoubtedly lay ahead. The life they were building would never be easy, the Wyoming frontier guaranteed that, but it would be rich with purpose, partnership, and love. 5 years later, Josephine stood on the same porch, watching Russ teach their 3-year-old son, Thomas, how to gently pet a newborn foal. Her hand rested on her swollen belly, where their second child was due to arrive before winter. The ranch had prospered beyond their expectations. The railroad had indeed come through, making cattle shipments easier and more profitable. The original Gibson homestead had expanded, absorbing some of Thorne's former holdings when they were sold at auction. What had once been a struggling operation was now one of the most successful in the county. More important than the material success, however, was the community they had helped build. The coalition formed to stand against Thorne had evolved into a ranchers' association that supported its members through hardships, shared labor during busy seasons, and presented a united front when necessary. Josephine served as its secretary, her Boston education proving unexpectedly valuable in the frontier setting. "Mama, look," little Thomas called excitedly. "She likes me." "Of course she does, sweetheart," Josephine replied, smiling as the foal nuzzled her son's outstretched hand. "Animals know a good heart when they meet one." Russ looked up, catching her eye across the yard. Even after 5 years of marriage, that simple connection still sent warmth coursing through her. He said something quietly to Thomas, then walked toward her, his stride easy and confident. "How are my girls today?" he asked, placing his hand beside hers on her rounded abdomen. "Who says it's a girl?" Josephine teased, leaning into his embrace. "A father knows these things," Russ replied with mock solemnity before breaking into a grin. "Besides, Charlie's wife is convinced it's a daughter, and that woman hasn't been wrong about a birth in 30 years. As if in response, the baby kicked vigorously against his palm. Russ's eyes widened with the same wonder he had shown when Thomas was born. "Strong, like her mama," he murmured. "I was thinking of naming her Ruth," Josephine said hesitantly. "After your mother?" Emotion flickered across Russ's face. "She would have loved that, almost as much as she would have loved you." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching their son's delight with the new foal, the spring sunshine warming their faces. Behind them, the ranch house that had once belonged to Thomas Gibson had been expanded and improved, but they had been careful to preserve its original character. The handcrafted mantel still displayed family photographs, now including their own growing family alongside the faded image of Josephine as a child. "Do you ever miss it?" Russ asked suddenly. "Boston, your old life?" Josephine considered the question seriously, as she always did when he asked it. "Sometimes I miss certain comforts, hot baths that don't require hauling water, theaters, bookshops. But no, I don't miss my life there." She turned to face him fully. "Everything I need, everything I love, is right here." Russ's eyes softened as he tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch as gentle now as it had been the first time. "They called you a burden, you know, when you first arrived, the Eastern lady who wouldn't last a month." "And what did you call me?" Josephine asked, though she knew the answer. His smile was as warm as the Wyoming sunshine. "A blessing, the best blessing I've ever known." As their lips met in a kiss that held 5 years of shared struggles and triumphs, hardships and joys, Josephine Gibson Fletcher knew with absolute certainty that she had found her true home not in the land itself, though she had come to love its wild beauty, but in the love of the man who had seen strength in her when others saw only weakness, who had recognized a blessing where others had seen only a burden. Together, they had built something that would endure long after they were gone, a legacy of love and determination that would be passed down through generations of Fletchers yet to come, as enduring as the Wyoming landscape itself.